We had people do the biohacking stuff or the electric knife fights or the make genetic material glow.
Niklas Anzinger is an entrepreneur and venture capitalist. He accelerates innovative startups, but he doesn't do it in the usual way. As founder and CEO of InfinitaCity and general partner at Infinita VC, Niklas invests in seed stage companies spanning biotech, hardware, and crypto. Everything from drone delivery to gene therapy. Based in Prospera, Honduras, he also hosts the Stranded Technologies podcast to explore how competitive governance can unlock innovations stifled by regulation. Niklas Anzinger, welcome to the show.
Fantastic to be here, Max.
So you've described Prospera as a layer 1 solution and InfinitaCity as a layer 2 solution. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so your audience is probably already a bit familiar with competitive governance, right? And I also heard you talk about Prospera before. So for anyone who's hearing about this for the first time, Prospera is building a startup city, kind of a Hong Kong for Latin America, on a Caribbean island called Roatan, which is part of the country of Honduras. And Honduras offers a special economic zone where Prospera can make their own legal and governance system. So they introduced a common law-based legal system there, based on some of the ideas of people like John Hasnes, who've been on the last episode of this podcast. Right. So, and we like to say, so how do you build a new city? How do you build a new sort of proto or minimal state or governance service provider? That's the question. Right. So Prospera has its own tax and labor law and its own business regulations. So for all intents and purposes, it kind of looks like a government, right? It likes to call itself a governance service provider, right? So providing the services that governments provide for profit and competitively and all of that. But there's a physical instantiation, right? So there's a physical shell, right? So you need to build a city. You need to be a place with infrastructure, with buildings, with roads, with everything like that, which exists to some degree, right? And Prospera has been, to some degree, buying that land and real estate from others, right? So involuntary private transactions. It has developed some of its own. So, for example, a 14-story Duna Tower. And there's many more things you need to do to build a new city or a new society or new jurisdiction, right? You need to bring people. You need to bring sort of industry that has some value and upside for you, right? So, and we came up with the idea of layer 1, layer 2, because it can't just be one organization that does everything, right? So if you look at actually existing societies or existing cities, there's multiple layers, more than 2, right? So imagine you're doing a business in a normal country. Many of these are kind of horizontal thin wedges, like a restaurant that has passed through customers or whatever. Here, you need to bring the people and do the restaurant that then serves people, right? So these are already 2 things, just as one example. And layer 1, layer 2 kind of came about because Prospera, because of the last 4 years and having had the challenge of a socialist government in Honduras that's trying to shut it down, was kind of bogged down a lot in diplomatic urgency. And I kind of used that as a shield to build up Infinita and bring a lot of people, right? So they could focus their work on the diplomacy, on the governance side, on some of the real estate and infrastructure side, and I could focus on bringing people in industry, right? So this is kind of when the layer 1, layer 2 distinction came about, right? So Prospera is a layer 1. It can have multiple layer 2s, right? So Infinita is the biotech layer 2, and people are building now a Bitcoin layer 2, a wellness layer 2, a fashion layer 2, and all of that, right? These can be some sort of physical districts within Prospera on the island, and can also be their own communities.
So our mutual friend, Alexander Bard, I think he's recently on the podcast. And one of the things he's fond of saying is that every place, every new place that comes into existence and it's dark humor in some respects, but in others it's kind of true. You need a temple and a brothel. I think what he means by that, in some sense, is that you need a sense of the sacred and a sense of the deeply cultural. How and yet, on the other hand, that can't be a rationalistic endeavor. It can't be like, okay, we need to plan for this. I mean, in some places, I'm sure they've tried and perhaps even succeeded. But I think in your mind, that's going to have to evolve, as you say. What do you think about the idea that a place for it to be sticky needs a culture?
Yeah, cultural emergence is something I think about a lot, and it's very important, right? So you're entirely correct that this is not like rationally planned or can be rationally planned, and people don't come like for the obvious, right? I'm saving X% on taxes or whatever, right? So they do something like this because they see meaning in it, right? So which and this is kind of true for any new startup or business that's really making a big difference, or a 0 to 1 and changing things fundamentally. Like initially you kind of have the ideologues, the innovators, and then you go to the early adopters, and then you go to like the early and late majority and all of that. So in the beginning you're attracting people that are in it for because they just care about it so much more about this than anything else, right? Because, the reality is in some ways it's harder, right? So, okay, you save on taxes and then regulatory and all of that. But at the same time, it's harder to do a business, right? Because there's not many people here yet,
Yeah.
right? And then sort of, the people that did a bank had to figure out, all right, so how do I get integrated with other correspondent banks in other countries? Like this jurisdiction isn't on any of their list, right? So, much of the upside in all of this, and I believe in it long term, it's why I'm here, like all the biotech, but much of these advantages, they only come through if it's enough people believing in it, right? But sort of for any individual at the given present moment in time, it's kind of an irrational decision, right? So it's kind of a coordination problem. If sort of thousands of people did it at the same time, it would make it much more likely to succeed. But for any individual person, if they decide to do it, it might not work for them, right? So that's a coordination problem to overcome. And what overcomes that is culture. Hey, here is why we're doing this. This is the meaning, like, and that is all right. We're creating sort of the new world, right? So we're creating a fundamentally new governance paradigm. And this is sort of still sounds like rational, and it kind of is, but people are attracted to it, like they get it. And then some of like the cultural instantiations are kind of naturally emergent, right? So during the pop-up cities, for example, we had people do like the biohacking stuff, or the electric knife fights, or the like make genetic material glow. um,
You
of
just have
course,
fun together.
exactly,
Yeah.
fun and parties and music and all of that. There is a certain vibe or style that emerges, and what I feel like became our temple is the infamous Infinita Dome, right? That you've probably seen, right?
Yeah.
And then the electric knife fights in the dome has like a very Mad Max Thunderdome kind of vibe.
Forgive this brief interruption, but I suspect you're here because you're disillusioned with legacy politics. If you're a creative, a builder, or an innovator, you might be ready to win funding. Through Human Respect Labs, you can get up to $30,000 to fund your next creative project. But not just any project. We're looking for 6 kinds of builders: video storytellers, community builders, writers, entrepreneurs, strategists, and innovators, any of which should be dedicated to human liberation. That means making government obsolete. Why? We know too much energy goes into politics, but not enough goes into real solutions. So if you're a freedom lover and you have a project idea that promotes peace, autonomy, and voluntary collaboration, we want to hear from you. Apply now at humanrespectlabs.org. That's humanrespectlabs.org. Criticize by creating.
I think culture isn't something you can centrally plan for either, right? So you kind of have to observe it and embrace it as it is emerging.
Well, you definitely do that. I mean, one of the things I've noticed, having been there, and I love seeing it in its nascency, but I also really enjoyed the kind of camaraderie and community that you've been able to establish there. And there does, it's not something that can be centrally planned, but it is something that must be catalyzed. And that requires a lot of planning on your part, planning on the part of you and your colleagues to invite people to come to something, right? So you are not only an entrepreneur and an investor, you've also had to be a community builder. Give us some examples of the kind of stuff that you do to build community.
Yeah, so I came to Prospera about 3.5 years ago, and there were not many people there, but it had some interesting business examples, right? So Mini Circle was there before. Mini Circle is a biotech company that did a gene therapy clinical trial here, and 2 years later they treated Brian Johnson here and brought him to the island. So there was some early embryonic signs there of what this could be, but there was not sort of a systematic, all right, how do we bring people? How do we create community and culture? And how do we basically go to market? How do we bring customers into this
Yeah.
that become part of this community? And that's kind of what I set out, the problem that I set out to solve then 3.5 years ago. And this was under sort of in hardcore mode, considering the circumstances with a Honduran government coming in just at the time that threatened to shut us down. Right. So, and our friends from Reason magazine, right? Headline. All right. Honduras charter city experiment is over. Oh, great. Now everyone thinks it's over.
Oh
Which
gosh. And you
I
guys
think,
fought through
yeah, exactly.
and you continue to
So
fight, right?
we continue to fight. And you know what? We've been grown at like normal startup rates since, right? So we
Wow.
had like 80% growth in new businesses per year, 80% year on year.
That's amazing. So notwithstanding Reason coming in and declaring the death of
Exactly.
Prospera and Infinita, you guys have continued to grow. Has
Exactly.
has the threat of the mainland government been your biggest headwind in all this, or have you been able to, or
Yeah.
have you had worse problems that you've had to overcome? What's the biggest problem?
Yeah. So I do think I'm not sure if the question is hinting at that there's also kind of a camaraderie effect from fighting against a sort of a government that wants to shut you down. Um, is that right? I still think on net it's bad to have that government, right? I think we would have done even better if it wasn't for that government. But
Well, it could be that you're burning too much cash, or there's all kinds of stuff that entrepreneurs have to face, and
exactly, like
you're being
I
investor,
think the big
entrepreneur, and
challenge
community builder.
is, yeah, I think the big challenge is that it's very hard to bring like businesses that are capitalized here that have some track record, right? So same in Prospera as in with Ciudad Morazan, the other charter city on the mainland, they have the same challenge, right? So we were able to bring people and businesses, and especially startups in our case, right? In Ciudad Morazan, it's residents, like there's actually 300 people living there.
Mhm.
But a hospital deal fell through. It's difficult to get real estate investors, right? Because real estate upside with sort of venture risk doesn't really work, right? So that means sort of the cash needs for Prospera were very high, sort of without able to be able to get a lot of sort of B2B revenue, and sort of the B2C revenue just comes. It is much harder to make that much money from it, right? Um, so on net, so the challenge is that people with high income typically have already made it somewhere else. They have a reputation there, and they have business and career success elsewhere, and that's typically tied to some degree to the place that they or the social environment that they're in, right? So why would they start over? They don't have a super strong incentive to do that, right? So
So you're dealing with little baby companies, and they're not
exactly,
well capitalized yet,
yeah.
and you hope that if they become a unicorn, they stay in town.
Exactly. And that
Um,
was my basically what I said then, what needs to be the survival strategy, right? Because we now have to take a bet on the startups, right? Because for them, the risk profile might actually as well be positive, right? Because they're default dead anyway. And if we sort of create a situation or a value proposition that makes them actually more likely to succeed if they're here compared to doing it traditional way, that could be that could work for them. And I think that's what we actually did, right? So that's what I think with all the like at demo days here, and we've gotten several dozens of startups funding. We had like Tim Draper here and Brian Armstrong and Balaji Srinivasan, and we built sort of a club of a couple of dozens, maybe a couple of hundreds of investors that really want to see this succeed and are sort of investing for the things that come out of here. It gives you an edge as a startup, right? Again, if it succeeds, if the regulatory advantages come through, then you can be like 10 times faster than your competitor, right? So that is a bet that is worth taking for startups.
So you've got you've got some companies that are incorporating there. They're still young, so they need to mature a little bit for the whole system to become completely self-sustaining into the future. And that sounds about right. But then there's also, I don't want to linger on this too much, but we talked about a cultural angle. There's also this idea that at some point, if it is to become sustainable as a city or a place with a sense of place, it's going to have some elements like girls or guys I can meet, as the case may be, to settle down and start families. And there again, that's not something that you can easily plan, but it's also something that if you have a bunch of guys starting businesses and not young women, or there seems to be an attractor model for young men, that you could see that it has a problem of sort of being settled by people with families and intergenerational torch passing for a place. Are you seeing a lot of young women come in as well as young men, or is it predominantly young men?
Yeah. So male-to-female ratio hasn't been that big of a problem for us, right? So it's of
Great.
course not 50-50, but it's probably like 65-35, which is not too bad,
That's really
right?
good. Yeah.
And so, and I think a big part of the reason is that, one is, okay, it's biotech is part of it, right? So biology is something that attracts more females. The other thing is just that, we had like just amazing women building this together with us, like my wife, Kara, and, the mayor has a girlfriend that's really well involved in the local community. And, one of Prospera's staff met someone here who's also now part of the whole endeavor and is a big part of the support system. And, once you have a certain critical mass together, they bring others and all of that. So I do think, and that's of course, but of course, it's not like a big dating market when you come in as a guy, right? So we're still like a group of maybe between 60 and 80 people on average at any given times. During events, we're a bunch more, right? So during the events we're organizing, there's a lot more sort of social life you have, right? Versus, there is a bit of seasonality, right? We went through the last couple of years, Roatan is a tourist island, so we kind of have a bit of that seasonality baked in. But I think, especially now with the elections coming up in Honduras, we really have a chance that we have the reverse of last time, that the headline is this time, hey, we survived. So,
Well, that was my next question for you. Was given the election, what does the future look like for you guys? Both layer 1 and layer 2, and think of it in terms of it being currently the Schrodinger's election, right? So it could fail or it could succeed. What does it look like if it fails? And then what does it look like if it succeeds? Failure first.
Yeah. So there's three major candidates in the election in Honduras. Two of which are good for us, one is bad, and one is like from the current government. But these are socialists. They don't like the kind of ideas of what we stand for. In the last election, they campaigned with the promise to shut us down. They haven't been able to so far. Like, you can never know for sure. Elections in Honduras are very chaotic. There will be all sorts of attempts to cheat or fraud. There is like reasonable worst case scenarios like the Venezuela or Nicaragua scenario, right? So this has happened before, and this is the kind of country where these things can happen, right? So I don't feel personally threatened, nor do we feel threatened here with regards to our property, right? So we're still on an island far away from the mainland, And the attempts so far by the Honduran government have been barking but not biting, right? Sort of overstepping into the territory of seizing private property and all of that. That's sort of a line where there is like triggers that scare these people to go that far. Maybe they would do that if they have like a lot of power and a lot of popular support or whatever, just like Hugo Chavez did in Venezuela. But they don't have that, even if they win these elections, right? So if they win these elections, we would actually expect there would still be some sort of reconciliation and maybe even some sort of agreement on the arbitration deal itself, right? So if anyone doesn't know, Prospera has a 10 billion arbitration case against the Honduran government because it's reneged on its promises. The most scenarios in the case where the socialist government gets reelected are not catastrophic for us and would probably allow us to continue in some form or another, just very far from sort of the optimal case where, you know, we have a supportive government and where we have just a much more business friendly climate in the entire country, right? Because I think the country as a whole in Honduras, it would be a challenge for the country, right? In terms of attracting capital and investment into the future. Of course, there is like a tiny tail risk of like a worst case, like Venezuela, Nicaragua scenario, but I think it's relatively tiny. The chance is actually higher that the government does not get reelected, right? So the government is very unpopular. They don't have as much power as some of the other examples that I mentioned. The polls are very contradictory, and you can't really trust them because, you know, they've been made or funded by, you know, self-interested parties. There's poly markets in Calci out, which have like liquidities of a couple of tens of thousands, so to be taken with a grain of salt. Like last week, our chances were about 80% or 85 that one of the opposition candidates wins. Now it's a bit further down to 60%, and it kind of oscillates between those. But overall, we think that 60 to 80% as a positive outcome range is probably reasonable. And then, you know, sky's the limit, right? Because like what I used to say 3.5 years ago when the new government came to power was like, okay, it may not work, but if it works, then we make history. Right? And you know, we're in this industry of like charter cities and, you know, the network state and all of that. Let 100 flowers bloom, free cities, and all of that. And you know, people been trying to do that for a bunch of decades, right? And I think this is by far the furthest we've come.
Yeah.
Right. So the way that I'm putting all my eggs in one basket here, I'm like, guys, we need to make this succeed now. It's just a delta between these two different stories. Like one story is that it took like a decade and more, and some, you know, really smart people made like a really clever constitutional amendment in Honduras. They even tied it to international treaties and investor protections and all of that. It went to international arbitration. It put all of these safeguards in, and it took like so long. And then there's still like a government coming in and they can just shut it down. Right? I think that would be quite disastrous for us in our industry. Versus the story is, all right, even though we were in a very embryonic state, the thing hasn't even started. And a socialist hostile government came in that threatened to shut us down. But we survived these 4 years, held out, grew nevertheless. Imagine what's now possible with a more friendly government. And then imagine what's possible when you have that story and now you have a bunch of sort of reasonable right-wing governments in Latin America, right? So like El Salvador, now Bolivia, Argentina, right? So Paraguay. So, and these countries are already interested in that model, right? Then we can be really confident. Here's something, here's a template, here's how we can make it work. And this just makes it so much more likely. I think the difference of that delta is like 5 to 10 years for this industry as a whole, which is why we really need to succeed in November and then also make sure that that's seen and many people in our movement come to support. Right? The Reason magazine headline is something supported this time, and like, you know, supporters of liberal governance around the world sort of come to help us truly seize that opportunity.
This is going to sound really speculative and probably not what you're used to as an entrepreneur, because I think it bears mentioning that for the most part, you're not making 5-year plans. You are testing value propositions and scaling them to the extent that you can. And you're pivoting when you can't. And this is kind of thinking a little bit more at the margins rather than architecting some grand strategy. Because grand strategies usually fail. There are coordination problems around them and so on. That being said, and I'm not trying to propose some grand rationalistic plan, but I'm imagining a future in which Prospera and InfinitaCity, layers 1 and layer 2, and for that matter, Morazon. What is it? Is
Ciudad
Cuidad?
Morazan,
Yeah. That becomes a little more successful. I worry a little bit about their short-term leasing model, but that's another story for another day. Maybe I'll have Joyce Brand on. But at the end of the day, we want these experiments to succeed. And it occurs to me that given their success, given their ability to create not only revenue that they might get used to in the mainland, especially in the capital, but also prosperity in general. It's like, oh, wow, this works. This is turning into Hong Kong. This is becoming something, and there's starting to be capital, wealth, people, families, culture. All of this is beginning to accrete on this little island. And what do you think about the possibility that this could evolve such that either it gets replicated in other jurisdictions around Latin America, or it spreads outside of the ZA jurisdiction to the point that the rest of the mainland wants to avail? The rest of the island of Roatan wants to avail of these good institutions. Is that even possible or in the realm of possibility, or is that more sort of a max theoretical pipe dream?
No, I think that's certainly within the realm of possibilities. Like I learned this just recently, but it was confirmed that when the new government came to power, there were a bunch more applications for ZAs, for zones. I didn't know it was actually 27 more zone applications.
When was this? When the
That was in
socialist?
2022, right? So before the government came into power,
Yeah.
there were 3 ZAs were already existing. Like there's a third one, Orquídea, Ciudad Morazán, and Prospera, and there were 27 more applications.
Ah, okay.
That the government basically nixed because they came into power.
But
right?
the next government might not nix them.
Exactly. Right.
And
so
if the next government were to accept them, you might be able to leapfrog, say, 10 or 15 years that it's taken Prospera.
Exactly. I mean, at least there is a path for more competition and more projects. And I think that's very important, right? So, I'm a Prospera maximalist, and Prospera is the reason why we're here and why we've come so far, right? Ciudad Morazán relied to some degree on sort of the lobbying of Prospera to kind of stay surviving and all of that. But I think what we need to truly succeed, like on a civilizational scale, is competition. Yeah. Right. So the first lever of competition, or the big success case we should look at, is not only Prospera, but is Honduras as a whole. Mm-hmm. Right. If we can prove this works for Honduras, and we've had reasonable success, right? So at some point, Prospera brought in, or the ZAs brought in 1/3 of all foreign direct investment in Honduras, despite the government, right? So imagine what's possible without. Right. So within like a year or two, like within the next year, with the existing kind of applications of other zones, with the existing investment interest, and if the government's coming out and saying, like, we like it, we embrace it, like the government could bring in billions of investment within just next year.
My kids ask me what I do for work, and I say, I write, talk into a microphone, and hope people send money. Now I'm questioning my life choices, but the kids gotta eat, and we have bureaucracies to topple. Support our work at underthrow.org, and for less than $5 a month, you'll help me rouse the rabble. Wait, what's underthrow? If overthrow is violent, underthrow is peaceful yet powerful. Real change doesn't start in Washington. Casting your vote with millions is like crying a teardrop into the ocean. Instead, we build consent-based communities that make traditional power structures obsolete. Left, right, or center, it doesn't matter. What matters is creating options for opting out and opting in. We build parallel systems in which people thrive, then just leave the old systems behind. It's about choosing communities, not imposing them. So, support the show, feed my kids, read the newsletter, and discover why most subversive acts amount to building a better civilization together. Visit underthrow.org. I don't know to what degree the current government, the socialist government, which, they could win again, are fans of China, which I hesitate to say that, and I do so tongue-in-cheekily. But let's imagine that they are fans of China, not of Mao, but maybe of Deng Xiaoping and of the two systems, one country model, right? Where China was able to really pull a whole lot of people out of poverty and still, drain some of these mega cities with all their innovations and all of their plenty that they're just pumping out into the rest of the Chinese mainland. Many of them were coastal cities at first, with, Macau and Hong Kong having been an example prior to, them coming back in 97, 98, I think it was, when Hong Kong was returned to Beijing. This seems to me to be like a way to communicate with, it's really hard for me to do that, Nicholas, you must understand, because there's so much that's wrong about the Chinese system. But at least to appeal to people who are socialists, who think that socialism is a model that can work, the kind of parallel systems model of China did work, at least relative to the past. Have you ever seen any kind of communications like that, or?
Yeah, so you could make the point, hey, stop copying like the worst stuff of socialism. Stop copying the good stuff like that China did with like allowing capitalism and private entrepreneurship, at least on a small scale, right? That's what made them rich. Right? Not everyone is actually aware of the story, right? So for us, like China is kind of seen as a monolith, but the story of how China actually became wealthy, especially economic zones, right? So they looked at Singapore, they looked at Hong Kong, and then they said, okay, let's try this capitalism thing out, but in a small scale. So it was a fishing village of Shenzhen with like 30,000 people or something like that. That was the first test bed, and then became a manufacturing hub. And now basically all of China's economic growth is in special economic zones, right? So at the same time, and as you call it, as a parallel system, right? So the political power firmly rests in the hand of the party, even though sort of the private entrepreneurship and business to a very large degree is working and is unleashed, right? So I'm not sure how to translate that to Honduras or the Honduran model, right? So I think there's just like a lot of differences. I do think in any scenario, Honduras is better with the zones or with status than without, right? Same as, I would prefer China to have liberal governance and all of that, but it's preferable to have, hundreds of millions of people out of poverty than not to have that, right? So that's how I think about that, right? So economic liberties are sort of a precondition for wealth and prosperity, but we've learned that they're not a guarantee for political freedom as well, right? So there's more that needs to be in place for that to happen.
I was one who, having sort of watched the Chinese miracle unfold and normalization of trade with China, and, this was happening around, the late 90s, early 2000s. I'm showing my age, but I remember all this, and I remember thinking how much promise this would bring to sort of unseat the CCP as a communist power. And it really didn't do that. They managed to, in some real Confucian way, create these engines of prosperity, but sort of bind them or harness them for their, not just the corruption of their party bosses, but also just to maintain power. And they have successfully done that but at the same time, milk to those engines of prosperity. Can you milk an engine? That's a mixed metaphor. You know what I mean? They've been able to extract a lot of that prosperity to maintain their power and to grow their power internationally too. Same as in the United States, I'll mention, but the imperial ambitions are probably more pronounced in the U.S., but it's the same kind of thing. We extract the prosperity of the engines of creation, and so do the Chinese. And this is the way they've been able to remain primarily a one-party state in an illiberal government, and that is rather a shame. I wouldn't want to put ideas in the heads of the socialist government of Honduras in that regard. But I definitely think that showing them that they can tolerate a parallel set of systems, more ZAs, more prosperity being generated within their borders, and having that jurisdictional arbitrage opportunities for Honduran people can only, like you say, be a net good.
Yeah. And, you know, it's a net good. And on the other hand, I try to avoid sort of the big picture geopolitics, right? Because, how do we know these things, right?
Yeah.
But I kept thinking these days about Balaji Srinivasan's sort of trifecta of like US, China, and internet, right? And the reason I was starting to think about that was someone else said that as well, who is not directly in the same conversation, and that is Hernando de Soto, who you probably also know, right? The author
Oh,
of
yeah.
the book The Mystery of Capital, like a Peruvian economist who basically argued that property rights are kind of the missing link, and the lector of holds the developing countries back, in terms of like building formal institutions and things like that.
Yeah.
And, the Honduran reformers were very influenced by Hernando de Soto. And what struck me about Hernando de Soto is also seeing him on podcasts recently, such as Bankless, is that he really gets new technology. He really understands the blockchain, and that's actually building kind of the property rights system of the internet, right? So on that episode, he was actually talking about sort of the hidden battle between three different ways of organizing property rights: the US way, the Chinese way, and the internet way. Right. So, and I do think we are sitting kind of firmly in, of course, some of the traditions of the United States and of liberal governance and sort of the best of it. Right. So we might think that some of the best of it is just like not there anymore, or it lives on in the internet. Right. That's kind of how biology said it. And I think there is something to that. Right. So the internet needs we need like physical places where the jurisdiction of the government applies, right? You can't sort of govern in a DAO or just virtually online in the metaverse, right? You're manifesting in the physical world. You have a physical appearance and body. So you need places where you can actually have some degree of legal autonomy, where sort of a different set of rules apply. And I think, again, that can be very beneficial for countries like Honduras without us necessarily being able to sort of directly influence, but I don't think anyone is really, at what sort of where things fall into, where pieces fall into in the geopolitical picture.
I have so many questions to follow on from that. I guess one would be, we've had Gabe Delgado on the show, who's one of the founders of Prospera, and thinking about him and thinking about Eric Bremen, his co-founding partner. Both of them are from Latin America originally, right? I can imagine a bunch of people from either North America or, like you, from Europe, who want to get involved, who want to try their hand at it. Explain, if you will, the importance of bringing in or involving Latin Americans and specifically Hondurans in any such endeavor like this.
Yeah. I mean, I have a company with about 15 people working here in total, but 50% of which are Honduran and 80% are Latino. So Prosper has probably about 50 to 60% Hondurans that are residents and live here and have the businesses. So the split is probably roughly similar for Prosper as well, right?
So it's not being colonized by...
Exactly.
Yeah.
Like, I think it's actually the most underappreciated fact about Prospera, right? So we're in an industry where you hear about, other projects in other parts of the world and pop-up cities and, a thing in Thailand and Argentina and a thing in California here and all sorts of places in Montenegro. I think nobody has had come anywhere close to us in terms of our success of local involvement. Like during my time here, I've probably done business and worked together with more than 100 local businesses, right? There's like the charity runs, the schools, more than 1,000 jobs created directly and indirectly, right? So there is just like, there's been not ever been a situation on the island where somebody didn't want to do like business with me because I was associated with Prospera. That just never happened. And that's
Yeah.
despite all the toxicity and controversy from mainland, right? So
Yeah.
business is such a force for peace, right? It's amazing, right? So I think we can really be proud of that success so far, right? So, my chief of staff is Honduran, my general counsel is Honduran, right? These are young people. Like my chief of staff is 22 years old. Like I found her when she was like 20, right? And she's,
She's
from
awesome. I know her.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And, she's been for the first time out of the country because of the company and getting this kind of opportunity she just wouldn't otherwise get. So that is just like so important, like for the social license to operate in a place or in a country. You need that. You need people like that to get the benefits from this kind of thing or change. And then you need to make them your supporters.
And they become advocates too. They become, I hesitate to say culture warriors because that has a connotation in the US that doesn't really fit, but they become deeply committed to what is happening, what is being created, inspired by the creative potential of human beings, that sort of thing. I think, just going back to Hernando de Soto, I was able to shake his hand, and he had a big effect on me in my intellectual development. And there were three things that he, basically said, as you say, land titles, you want to be able to assign property rights and for those property rights to be firm so that I know the difference between mine and thine, and therefore I can, you know, um, do with what I can with what I own, right? Then there is, of course, reducing regulatory barriers to starting up a little business. So in Peru, of course, where he lived, they have all these little shanty villages, and they have all these little tiny micro businesses where people are rolling stuff down the street, and that's their business. And they don't have, they're in the informal economy, so they can't really scale. They can't take the proceeds of that and buy a little place and make a restaurant because, for one thing, it might take 260, 270 days in any of these developing countries just to meet the regulatory compliance costs and burdens. This is for people who are poor and are trying to make ends meet with a little cart, an insuperable problem. One of the things that he was never able to do, I think, with his ideas so much was get them to catch fire in the minds of the people culturally. One way to do that would be for a proof of concept like Prospera to emerge and flourish. You just say, look at what we're doing here. How do you argue with that? But this cultural thing that you guys have had to encounter, where you first have to say, no, we're not, we're not the white colonizer trope that is so, going around right now in leftist circles around the world. We're also not, we're not trying to take anything from you. We're trying to create. And then just whether or not you look at me and my associated ideas, that there is a path to prosperity and freedom for you, and this is what it looks like. That's a hard thing for us to do here in the country that's supposed to be founded in freedom. So I guess it might be easier for Latin America to catch fire in terms of the ideas, because they're tired of being poor, whereas in the United States, it's a low-cost proposition to adopt socialist ideas because you've been raised in such comfort. I don't
Yeah.
know. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, this sort of goes to the thing that I'm kind of grappling with. How much do people actually mean what they say they believe in, right? So, or like the revealed preferences thing, right? So, there is like meta preferences, like you have a preference about being healthy, and then there's like revealed preferences. Do you go to the gym every day? Like, no, you don't, right? And I think it's a bit of a similar thing in with libertarians, but also in politics in general. I don't think that's exclusive to libertarians. That, it's very cheap to express certain beliefs and argue about them, right? That's cheap. Same with socialism, right? But it's a completely different thing to actually give something up, like some of your time, some of your money, um, maybe try something different something new that would, lead to, right? You wouldn't have the same reputation that you otherwise have. So very few people, extremely few, are willing to do that at any given point.
Why they vote for socialist rather than giving to charity?
Yeah, I mean, voting is easy, right? It doesn't cost you much or anything, right?
Or start a charity for that matter. I mean,
Exactly.
yeah.
And even when we do things, people often do the things not to actually do the good thing, but also to like seem that to do the good thing. But otherwise, people would make like very different choices, like especially charities who are not very effective and all of that. Um, the book by Robin Hanson, The Elephant in the Brain, influenced me a lot there. And this is a reality, right? So everyone's like that, including libertarians, including contrarians, including rationalists, right? So, and we sometimes have a bit more of a light in the darkness to look for the right things, but overall we're still like surrounded by darkness and ignorance. Right. So we should just never believe that we're beyond that. All we can do is sort of put out little experiments and tests to figure out if we can coordinate towards something different. Right.
Yeah.
And how that looks like is, well, basically in the beginning, it's super hard and, nobody believes this is possible. And, I have to talk to like 100 people to get like one person here. Right. So, or the same with like raising money for investment. This is how it looks like when you talk to, the kinds of companies that really made a difference. That's like all of their stories. And then you hit a moment or you hit an inflection point where things work. The product is in the hands of people. They benefit from it and they spread the awareness of it without necessarily arguing or like the ideological beliefs that come with it, but it's spread or it scales through the concrete benefit it gives you. Just to give you one example, so think of Bitcoin or cryptocurrency, right? So I'm pretty sure you've been aware of Hayek before and of the idea of like private money and private banking and all of that. I don't think that many people were, right? I mean, I sort of was aware, but I didn't spend that much time studying it. Because what is the benefit of me to be really deep or steeped in these ideas, right? There's no upside from it other than, okay, I look good in front of my friends if I can seem smart, or there's a couple of university chairs that hire some economists that write books about these ideas, right? It's a very tiny group of people. But now with Bitcoin and with some of these ideas baked into the technology, it becomes that knowledge makes you money, right? So understanding, should I, sell or should I hold long term because it could be a thing long term, or the other cryptocurrency, whatever. Like having accurate beliefs about like the design or features or ways in which a currency works, that now becomes valuable to you, right? You make money with it. So that means the product, the Bitcoin, the Ethereum, the whatever, comes or brings with it an education in its values. Like every holder of Bitcoin or whatever needs to have or has at least some amount of education in sort of the monetary ideas behind it, right? And I think I'm not sure it will be entirely the same for startup cities, network state, or whatever, right? So to some degree, it will just be like a good product for people, and people don't have to think about like the ideas behind them. They just get like cheaper housing, and they get like better medical treatments and all of that, right? And they don't necessarily have to think about all these ideas. But that's ultimately the only way that we know in which I think such ideas can really succeed or scale, that they're adopted in some form of way.
The world speaks in riddles, markets, politics, power, the very nature of consciousness itself. But what if there were guides, a secret fellowship dedicated to reading the signs, to building bridges between the seen and the unseen? The gray robes operate in the space others fear or cannot comprehend. We map the territory between spiritual awakening and practical revolution, between ancient wisdom and radical innovation. 12 dimensions guide us. One mission impels us. Find out more at grayrobes.org. That's grayrobes.org. I think that's a really, really important thing for us to linger on for just a moment. It means that we have to think about incentives and cultural phenomena working in tandem. For us to win, for us who are on the communications front lines like me, you're the doer. You're certainly a thinker, but you've had to choose to be more than a thinker, and that's a doer. My role in all of this, to the extent that I have one, is to be a thinker and a communicator. And thinking and communication must come with incentives, right? So that's a hard thing for me to achieve as a communicator. But as someone who is an innovator, that's when things get interesting. I said one time to this fellow who runs a Bitcoin podcast named Breedlove that the Bitcoin white paper is a moral document. And it's hard to see it. It's not, it's not right there, but it's just so assumption laden. And once you start to appreciate why Bitcoin works and has stuck around, as you said, you have probably started with the incentive to look into it because you thought you might make a little money. In the end, you see why it works and what it does to achieve that level of growth. Then you start to be able to extrapolate that into other domains. And I think that the same thing can be said for the layer 1 and layer 2 of Prospera is the short thing. But then there's this issue of network effects. Okay. All right. So period paragraphs, just going in a different direction for a minute. Because we're kind of zooming to a place where you show just how look at this Hong Kong on Roatan that we've created. You're not there yet. It's on its way. And there could be, as you said, an inflection point where that could come to pass. And then you can just point to this success story and say, look at what we've done. This didn't extract anything from anybody on the mainland. All this did was take capital and turn it into something beautiful and burgeoning, right? But then you have places that from an institutional standpoint, whether it's the federal level or the local level, like San Francisco, that are terrible set of institutions, and yet they have massive network effects and a whole hell of a lot of rich people sitting around down on Sand Hill Road. How do you compete with that?
Yeah, good question. So I think about that a lot, obviously. So, places like San Francisco, New York have built-in network effects, right? So the fact that there's so many rich people there, that is good for you as a startup, right? Because, rich people, of course, they get lazy, right? And I don't take that, of course, they typically worked insanely hard before. So why shouldn't they make their home and everything's like that, comfortable, right? And that means it's good to be closer to them, right? Because they don't want to venture out or go to places like Honduras or whatever. Actually, a surprising number, if you think of it, have actually done that, like some of the names before. So these places have layers upon layer, right? Because the rich people are there. That also means they have the physical space and infrastructure, the biotech labs, and all the kind of stuff that sort of capital creates and buys, right? And you cannot compete with that on sort of the mainstream market. like San Francisco, just like you won't beat it for AI companies, right? Or sort of the Y Combinator type founder. Where you can beat it, or where you have to think about, is the margins. Like, what's a type that San Francisco doesn't work for? Right? There's a type of biotech, frontier, crypto entrepreneur, maybe, that's like, wait, my problem is actually the regulations, right? So, I actually want to do something bigger here, and actually California is a problem for me here, or like, the that just doesn't work for me, right? So I'm looking for, Austin, Miami, and some of them Prospera, actually, right? So, right now we capture a very tiny flow of these kinds of people, but we're capturing them, right? So you have to think of like somewhat on the margins and have to figure out, all right, how can you provide value for this type of person, and how can they help you scale it? But because you can't stay like on the fringe, you have to grow to become something that then attracts more of the mainstream, right? So you have more of the infrastructure, you have more of the dating market, you have more of the capital and rich people and all of that. And that then in the end makes the whole place grow. But on the other hand, that's also always been the story of any of these places. Like that's been the story of Hollywood and, Go West Young Man and all of that, right? So they were disenfranchised with sort of the East Coast elites and
It's the
things like that around
pioneer
the time.
spirit. You're tapping into it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that's just like, it's the story each time, right? So, the question is, do you want to be part of that story, or the next place where that story is happening? It will happen in some places, right? And in a kind of way, in a weird way, that's what I've always been trying to look for. Where is the next, like Hong Kong on day one, the next Hollywood, the next Silicon Valley? It's not yet there, but here is where it actually could happen.
Well, people might be really surprised to learn that you've been able to bring some serious badasses down to that little island. Everybody, I mean, I think it's Tim and Adam Draper, Naval Ravikant, Balaji Srinivasan,
Brian Armstrong, Brian
Brian
Johnson.
Armstrong. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Vitalik, has Vitalik
Vitalik
been
was
down
here
there?
recently. He was just here last week.
Okay, there you go. See, so you're bringing in these really big guns,
Mhm.
and they have capital, and they're also believers in some sense. And that's the interesting thing about when you do bring those folks in, and you put a bunch of young, hungry entrepreneurs in front of them with the kind of events that you hold. That's a magic combination, because they're starstruck on the one hand, but they also feel like they've had a special contact with mentorship of on the order of those names. That's profound.
Yeah.
Um,
And maybe this is a good opportunity to really sing a song of praise actually to Tim Draper and Adam Draper, because to me, these are the people that really actually are the OG Silicon Valley spirit, right? So, the OG spirit is the permanent frontier. It's not like, hey, we're getting lazy and comfortable here on our central road. Tim Draper was one of the first ones to do like a global Draper University and go to like Brazil, to India. Entrepreneurs are everywhere and all of that. Like he's the first one. Okay, the idea sounds crazy. I'm in. All right, where nobody else is in. Like Adam Draper in a similar way. So Tim Draper was too like Bitcoin pilled, but Adam Draper saw no, other things work as well, right? So he backed Coinbase and all of that. And now with Bio the same, right? So he's, I think, one of the main supporters of sort of our alternative FDA thesis. Like the way biotech currently works, this is not going to work. You need a rebellion, right? So to me, these people are like the ultimate sort of resemble the infinite frontier, right? So this must continue. This is no accident why they've been so supportive of this, and I'm very grateful for that.
okay. Last question. I really appreciate your time. You've been wonderful. I want you to tell us about the Infinite Games.
Yeah. So the Infinite Games, so anyone who's listening is welcome and invited to the Infinite Games 2026. So it is a 2-month long event, all of February and March next year. So it's from February 1st to March 31st. So the last 2 times we did a pop-up city, right? So we brought like technologists and scientists. But we wanted this time to do something a bit more cultural, right? Something a bit with a more broader appeal, right? So we felt that pop-up cities sort of has like a tiny niche of crypto nomads, and that's a bit saturated by now. With the Infinite Games, we wanted to do something where you can bring like your friends and your family, and you do a poker night or prediction market tournaments, or you try out the electric knife fights, or learn to do free diving, right? So it's a series of competitions. So some are athletic, right? So there's going to be a longevity biomarker challenge where you get tracked before, during, and after, and it will be part of a scientific study. And all the various sports tournaments like tennis and whatever. And others will be sort of more fun and games, like the poker, the golf, and stuff like that. So it's something for everyone. We'll have like a STEM challenge, like a math Olympiad style competition for kids, right, for teenagers, right? So where they will work like with robots and with software and with AI and things like that. So this is going to be happening this year, and I really also hope that it can be like the thing to point at after the hopeful success of Prosper in the next election. Like, look, we made it, and now we have this amazing place, and let's celebrate. Right? Let's celebrate sort of human advancement and ingenuity, right? The athleticism, the science. Let's have some fun while we're doing it, and build the kind of future we want to see.
Are you going to have a pitch competition there as well, like that you traditionally do, like near the end, maybe?
Yeah, there's also going to be a bio residency during the time, right? So we're going to do 1 month, the month of March, for founders, predominantly in biotech, to get training and then pitch at the end of the demo day. We'll probably do like some side track as well for founders that are not at biotech.
So I am, of course, such a fan of you, of Prospera, of InfinitaCity, and all of the great companies that are springing up. I want to make sure that with the publication of this episode, we get all the information for the Infinite Games down for anybody who's interested, and they can reach out to you if they have questions. Is that right? They can reach out to your folks?
Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. Niklas Anzinger, you are a dear friend, and I'm so glad to see that you're going to be successful and not only get through this next election, but through the inflection point you described. Thank you very much for coming, my man.
Your support is always appreciated, my brother.